conditions. And so for any PHAs that had physical scores that were below a 60 for particular developments, we've been reaching out to those PHAs and having conversations in all of these goals. What we are really trying to do is engage with the housing authority, have the conversation with the AD, with the board, and to understand what the PHA's plans are for improvement in whatever area it is that we're addressing. The same applies overall with any housing authority that is at risk under a designation of being troubled, or in some cases it may be substandard in a particular area, like management, which for example would mostly be an occupancy issue. So any PHAs, I guess, have questions about where we're interacting on any of those issues?
And I guess the other thing I'd add, Joe, is our repositioning goal continuing to talk to PHAs about repositioning. HUD's continuing to talk about ways to make repositioning work where it hasn't yet, looking at ways to maybe expand the Section 18 blend, RAD Section 18 blend to allow for some greater blending to make that more viable and more attractive to PHAs. So more to come out on that. Of course, there's a repositioning session in this series later. They'll talk more on repositioning. Was somebody wanting to speak there? All right, so I'll throw out a question because it's one that's come up recently. So, can a housing somebody there? Somebody have a question? Ms. Madero, I think we're hearing you. Do you have a question? All right, so I'll throw a question. Can a housing authority hire an immediate family member of an executive director? Father, mother, brother, sister, child. Can you hire? I think, Ms. Madero, we're hearing something in the background there. So can you hire a family member? What say you?
I say no.
So the low rent ACC says it has a part 19A and 19B. 19A says you can't contract or enter into agreement or arrangement with any of this group of people, which is, like your commissioners or during their tenure or for a year thereafter, elected officials, housing authority employees who are involved in making policy. And so that 19A talks about that. And then there's a 19B, and 19A has to be waived by HUD. Then there's a 19B that says you cannot hire any of the immediate family members of these parties. And it again lists the board and elected officials and staff members who influence policy, et cetera. And then it says on that one, on 19B, that the board can waive that for good cause. But what we've recently been given guidance from HUD headquarters is that even in those cases where, so we had a recent case where it was the ED's husband was the maintenance staff person, and they interpreted it. In fact, Tim Daniels had given a legal opinion saying this can be waived by the board under 19B. But headquarters has come out clearly and said no, it's also a conflict under 19A that requires HUD to waive it. So in those cases, and we have some around the state where there's mom and pop PHAs or immediate family members working there, at some point we're going to be reaching out to each of you whenever we encounter that and say, look, you'll have to ask for a waiver if you want to continue that employment. So far, I haven't seen one approved. So just a heads up that there's been some kind of The ACC is not real well written in this respect. The 19B implies that the board can waive it without HUD weighing in, but HUD Legal has determined that it's a conflict under 19A. So you'll have to request waivers if you encounter that. There's supposed to be a new ACC coming out that does remove the board's ability to waive takes that out completely, but it still leaves a little ambiguity on the conflict stuff. So I just wanted to pass that along. If you know folks who have that situation, you might give them a heads up. That employment may have to end soon if they can't get a waiver by HUD. Lorraine, Joe, jump in anything you want to talk about. If you want to ask a question to our audience. So, okay, here's another. CARES Act funding. What can you spend your public housing CARES Act funding on? Right? I mean, it's obviously a long answer. Is there anything that you spend normal operating funds on that you cannot spend CARES Act funding on? So CARES Act funding, we didn't do a great job with this when it came out. You can whatever you can spend normal operating funds, capital funds or operating funds, you can also spend your CARES Act funding on those purposes. And vice versa, right? Anything you can spend CARES Act funding on, you can now spend your normal operating funds for. So we are encouraging housing authorities to quickly obligate and disperse and spend those CARES Act funding. That way you can set your books, you have your books closed and your records. You got to keep reporting on that CARES Act funding until you have it spent. So for those housing authorities that have a large, is it 150,000? Was that the threshold?
David, that's correct. It's 150,000, and
yeah, if you'll have to keep reporting unless you get it spent, and then you can simplify that.
And David, I'd also say too is that regarding the deadline for the public housing CARES Act spending, excuse me, the initial deadline was December 31st of 2020, but that's since been changed to December 31st of 2021. Regardless, we're still talking with PHAs about spending that money sooner rather than later. It's part of the Public Housing CARES Act, which the intention was to stimulate the economy, so where we can get PHAs to consider anywhere they have immediate need, and pretty much all PHAs would have immediate need under traditional purposes for operating fund or for capital fund to spend that funding first, or sooner rather than later. We want to encourage PHAs to do that. I think what we found in San Antonio is until we've talked to PHAs more, we've encountered a lot of hesitancy and a lot of PHAs looking to look for something that was defined in the notice as COVID related. But again, we just want to emphasize that it can be any traditional public housing operating or capital fund activity that PHA can eligibly spend. And it will not take away the PHA's ability to spend funds on COVID related needs as defined in the notice. And that will extend until December 31st of 2021. But we are asking our folks in the HUD San Antonio office to follow up with PHAs and to talk about your plans to spend that money so that we can answer questions and get to clarity and a clear understanding of what those funds can be used for.
Yeah, we really fumbled the ball on this one. On the early guidance certainly implied not only to housing authorities but to HUD staff that this had to be COVID related, and even in subsequent guidance, I think poor word choice kind of perpetuated that misunderstanding that it had to be a COVID related expense. So we're working hard to dispel that misunderstanding. It can, any normal operating expense, you can use those funds for that.
I have a question.
Shoot.
Hi, it's Brandy in Victoria. I know it's a tad bit feeding off of this, but the Section 8 admin money that we received, is it available the same way as far as using on any regular administrative or Section 8 expense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
David, I would just add to that for the supplemental administrative funds. Of course, you couldn't use those for, it may go without saying, but you can use those for HAP. So, just keeping that in mind.
Noel,
Joe,
you're
did you,
usually not quiet. What's up? Go ahead. Who was speaking?
Joe, did you say that you cannot use those for HAP or that you can?
Apologize, I was on mute. That you cannot use the supplemental funding for HAP payments. And so on that, there are some set-asides within CARES Act for PHAs that are experiencing increases in their per unit costs. And if you have a question as to whether your PHA is eligible for that funding, additional HAP funding, you can check with your contact at each respective HUD office. There's a way to identify where PHAs have had those increases. And I think the deadline to apply for that funding is coming up. It's at the end of this month. And so, if your PHA is eligible, it's a simple application for that. But for the public housing, for the HCV admin funding, you cannot use that for HAP payments.
Right, just like you can't use normal admin fees for HAP payments. Once your admin fee rolls into the reserve, there's some differences on what you can use it for. But during, initially, and remember these admin fees, the CARES Act admin fees cannot roll into your reserve. If you don't spend them, you'll have to give them back. So that's what distinguishes them. Where normal admin fees, once they roll into your reserve, you have some ability to use that for HAP, but not during the year in which, not until they become part of your reserve.
And the same is true for the Public Housing CARES Act funds. Those cannot be commingled with reserves. You will be allowed an extended period up until the end of next calendar year to use the funding, but it will not be allowed to go into reserves.
Noel, you always have a lot of questions. What's on your mind?
Well, I have a lot of confusion about all this, David, to be honest with you. Because I understand the statements you all just made right now about that this monies cannot go to reserves, but if the monies can be used for operations, and in previous conferences that I've had with you all, the instructions we were given is to use this money first. So if I use this money first and some of it, and I use some of it for operations, what does that mean? That means that I have money left over from my regular administrative fee and from the operating subsidy. So at the end of my fiscal year, which it just happened in September, I'm gonna have additional administrative fee monies. Why? Because some of the monies that I used for operations came from the COVID, the CARES Act monies. So it just seems like it doesn't make sense to me that we can use it for regular operations.
Semantics. Yeah, it's a little bit semantics, right? If you use this money, let's say your next 2 months of expenses under admin fees, you use your CARES Act funds, and so now the admin fees that you would have used for that, those don't get used. So at the end of the year, your reserves go up by 2 months. That's fine. It's kind of a semantics thing. So I understand what you're making. You still end in the same spot, but the difference is this CARES Act funds, they're going to say, show me where you spent that money. And you got to have your separate P&L for that, right? And
Yes,
in there, you
yes.
can't say augment reserve. So it's that's why it goes back to what we're saying. Why not use that money
Hello,
first?
Keisha.
Get it spent. Yeah.
Hello,
So
Keisha.
it comes out to be more
This is Lieutenant
how you
Antoine.
report it
I
then,
am
right,
calling.
David?
I'm trying to see.
Somebody's on the
Um,
phone with another person. Okay. Go ahead, Noel.
I was going to say it's more as to how we're reporting, right? Because if we're
Right.
reporting the CARES Act money and we have operating expenses under that category, that we have CARES Act COVID expenses that normally aren't covered, but then we have operational expenses that the CARES Act money was used for, and it's all used up. That's just the way we got to report it when we do our quarterly report, whenever that comes up, and then we should be okay. That the
Yeah.
money, the
We're
admin
not
fee that's
saying
left
go
over
out and
goes to
look.
reserves.
Right. We're not saying go out and look for a way to burn through this money. Particularly if you're low reserves, and a lot of PHAs, particularly on the admin fee side, are low. This is a great time to kind of solidify things and ultimately add your reserve, not with this funds, but by using this funds to cover your normal operating expenses. Your reserve balance would go up because your other funds don't get used. So, yeah, it's the messaging is. We definitely created some confusion, and we see that around the country. Why, here we are, how many months into this, and we've only got about half the CARES Act funds spent. So PHAs are
David?
real. When we freaked out when PHA started to spend it that first month, we really sent the wrong message.
Yeah, and that's
David,
what
and
I told my controller about. At one time you all had said that we needed to get approval, like on the public housing side, before we could draw down. And I told my controller, I said, if we can use it for regular expenses, why do we need approval? I don't understand. I didn't understand that. And
David, this is Joe, and I just want to just clarify something with Mr. De Leon or any of the PHAs that might be in the San Antonio jurisdiction. I think your thinking is correct on the first way you described as to what would actually end up being the result with extra funding being available in your regular program if you use CARES Act money up first. I think that's exactly what would happen when you reach the end of your operating year. Your funds that are left over in your traditional programs carry forward as reserves. The difference with CARES Act is that it does expire when you hit those deadlines. So anything unused would then be returned back to Treasury. On the issue of the initial guidance that went out, I think in the early days of talking about this, I think a lot of the emphasis was on the expenses being COVID related, which is why since we've been making an effort to clarify that it's not just COVID related, it is for traditional operating and public housing. And then there was a point, I think, where initially some PHAs had immediately drawn down the entire amount of funding or more than 50% of it. And so with those PHAs, we did follow up and we said one of the requirements, and this is for public housing CARES Act funds, there has to be immediate need. And HUD went on to further define that to say when you draw the money, you would need to be essentially writing the check within 3 days, for that money that you drew. So that would demonstrate that you had immediate need. And so if you didn't, what we allowed PHAs to do was to return the funds, but not to lose the ability to use them. They were just returned to the account to then redraw the funds when there was immediate need. And we did talk about, as I think you were alluding to right now, this idea that we would be controlling, overseeing each of those draws, that ended up not being necessary. We didn't want to put any unnecessary barriers. So for any PHA that has tried to draw, you should have been able to do that without HUD having to approve anything. And so if it is the case where any PHA found that they were not able to draw the CARES Act funds, please bring that to our attention, and we'll address that. But I think there was some discussion of having to do that in the early days when there was confusion about those initial draws. But really, it was just that issue that I just described. We were just trying to make sure that the housing authorities that drew early and drew the entire amounts or most of it did have that immediate need. So hopefully that clarifies things.
Yeah, we created ample confusion in the early days.
David, I did have one other question, and it concerns the future quarterly reporting we're supposed to do. Now, let me just give you for instance, my fiscal year ended September 30th. Let's say I used 100% of my my COVID, my CARES Act admin money. And as I understand it, I can still, going forward, I can still use the administrative fee money that I get, the regular money, for COVID expenses, as long as I identify it as a COVID expense that is not normally covered. Now, my question would be, when the quarterly reporting comes around, since I already used the CARES Act money, I don't have to report that anymore, even though I'm using it for COVID, or do I still have to report that even though it's above and beyond the CARES Act money that I got?
My understanding, and I'll let other folks chime in, my understanding is once you spent the CARES Act funding, you don't have to report further on the CARES Act funding. Now, you can, like I said earlier, you can, whatever you're spending CARES Act, the eligibility for CARES Act, you can use your normal funds for that too. So you don't have to normally report to us how you spend your normal funds, except, you're subject to audit and your final, reporting and eligibility use of those funds. But it because you use it for a CARES Act related thing doesn't make it CARES Act funding. It's the source of the funds that was CARES Act first that you have to report on. So I think what you were saying, I agree with that. Yeah, if you want to buy some masks later for employees, when your CARES Act funds are still spent, you don't go and report that as a CARES Act expenditure because CARES Act is already closed out.
And what about reporting on the FDS when you file that? Would that have to be separated because it's not a normal expense, a covered expense?
It's an eligible expense. So I guess you find where it fits under. I don't know if there'd be a separate line item under FDS. I guess most of this would fit under some existing line item, right? Administrative or supplies, or it depends again how you used it. I don't know that there's going to be a separate line on the FDS for CARES Act, except that you want a separate P&L. Here's expenses on all the CARES Act fund, but I don't think we're expanding the regular FDS line items to add anything special.
Mr. De Leon, I would just add that there was a recent call with REACT because a lot of questions came up on the reporting. So I don't know if you attended that call, but they were trying to go back and clarify some of the questions, the answers to some of the questions out there on reporting. And they were trying to simplify the FDS submission so that where they did have to add some line items, it was going to make it simple for PHAs to report. But I think if there's a specific item that you're trying to report on that you're unsure about how to fit that onto what you normally use for reporting, we can get that question to the right person in REACT that's working with the reporting and get it answered. And I would say the same to anyone. If you've listened to the presentations for housing authorities on the reporting and you didn't get your question answered, please just get it to us and we'll try to get that question answered for you to
And there's
make it
definitely
easier.
going to be more guidance continuing to come out on all these topics.
Thank you, Joe.
Megan, what's going on in San Antonio?
Oh, I'm sure like everybody else quite a bit. I was actually just taking some notes on the CARES Act funding discussion that we were just having. Think it's pretty interesting. I think it will be much easier to expend those funds once we have all of the details on reporting requirements. I know that.
Right. Yeah, I think that certainly held up. I understand why Pitch had say, you know, well, I'm going to wait until the reporting guidance is out and complete, just to say, you know, I got plenty of time to spend this money. I'm going to wait until I know exactly what to do and how. So I get that, and I think that's been some of the delay in people obligating and expending is just waiting for firm guidance on the reporting.
I do have a question on the CDC order on eviction. If your staff is working on any kind of guidance or outreach related to that for PHAs.
So I can respond, David. So the simple answer is no. There's not additional guidance that we're working on. I know the initial moratorium expired at the end of July, and so at that point, folks were looking to see if there were going to be extensions. There was an extension that was really done through, I guess, an executive order. And then there were, I guess, you know, some questions around that. We really don't have anything else other than what was already issued. And so I do know that in San Antonio, for example, there has been coordination with the city to look for ways to help those families that would then possibly be facing eviction because they had not paid their rent during that time period of the moratorium, and now it was all due. And the city does have a program where they were working and coordinating also with the courts, so that when folks showed up for the eviction hearing, they would try to work with landlords to get them to understand that the city had a program to assist families, and if the landlords, you know, were to agree that their tenant would participate in that program, the landlord would get paid and then agree not to evict. And so there was some of that cooperation happening. I know other localities had maybe different approaches, but those are the types of programs, I guess, that, you know, we've seen happening to address situations. And then also we're asking housing authorities where you do have the ability, you have some flexibility on providing or establishing repayment agreements with folks who did end up having some rent that was unpaid, some families that were unable to pay their rent. There were lots of jobs lost during that time period. And so we have a toolkit that is out on the HUD website. And I don't know if you've seen that, but we can certainly provide that information, which really does encourage the housing authority to work with families to see if unpaid amounts can be worked out through a repayment agreement.
Yes, that's something that we've definitely been using. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say to your question, we did seek some guidance from HUD headquarters on how the CDC CDC ruling affects housing authorities. And I know Garrett spoke about it on our regular weekly conference calls we've had with Fort Worth PHAs. Eva, do you recall the details on that, to be conversant about what we found out, what we got back from headquarters? I'm hesitant to ad lib on that.
And well, no, just that, we weren't administering it. It's a CDC guidance, it's not ours. So the purpose was really not to try and, have families be unhoused, but to keep them housed. But there was something else that I want to remind folks too, that you can use those, CARES Act admin funds for landlord incentives too, whether you're trying to, help with some of those deposits. I think it was not deposits. It
was a tricky one, right? So you could help with you could do an incentive fee to retain landlords, right? So
right.
An incentive to a landlord to work with the tenants. You couldn't give the tenant the money to pay their rent, but you could incentivize the landlord to. So some housing authority said, look, we have if you're willing to do a repayment agreement with a tenant, we offer an incentive that you get to keep as the landlord for doing so. And so there were some unique things you could do on that. But yeah, like he was saying, that it wasn't our, so how much is this publicized? The CDC ruling, do tenants know? It's supposed to say they applied for public assistance. It certainly raises some questions, and I guess it's kind of judge to judge how that's going to be enforced, because there are a lot of questions surrounding it. But HUD has not, to my knowledge, come out with anything saying here's how we're going to work with that, or here's how it affects PHAs.
David, before we leave that one, I just would add, we were able to clarify that where, say for example, you have a program working like the one in San Antonio, if say the city was funding that program and part of the funding came from a different part of HUD, say it was under CDBG, for example, and that's just hypothetical. I'm not saying that that's how they're funding their program, but would it be considered an eligible use for someone to receive that assistance, given that they're in a different HUD program, public housing? So we did get confirmation that is possible, and I think even on the there was a form that folks were having to fill out, that they were seeking some kind of assistance or something of that nature, and so that is eligible. That's something that can happen, even if they're say in one of the public housing or the HCB program, but they receive assistance from money that could be traced back to a different HUD program. That is allowable.
Yeah, so that double subsidy fear that is always out there, I guess they cleared that's not a concern there. One of the things I've asked, and I'm hoping we'll have more discussion, maybe headquarters will think about it, because as we encourage PHAs to adopt, to allow repayment agreements to be flexible and working with tenants, a repayment agreement can affect your TARs for years, right? If you do a long-term repayment agreement, it's going to affect your tenant accounts receivable score for a while. And so I'm not clear, and I haven't heard them say yet, would we consider appeals, like FAS appeals, say, yes, my TARs is 5%. It's because I have, X dollars worth of repayment agreements resulting from, this COVID period, and I followed HUD's guidance and entered into lots of repayment agreements where I otherwise may not have. So yes, my TARs are high. We know that, but it's, would you have a good cause to get some slack on your FAS score? It seems reasonable, but I haven't, seen anything on that. So but there's still time. We haven't started FOS scoring yet, so you could certainly appeal any component of FOS. But hopefully we'll, headquarters will think about some of those things. How do we deal with that, right? We don't want to have negative impact. Occupancy for those housing authorities that were really impacted by occupancy that will, during the COVID period, are we still going to hold you to a 98% overall occupancy for the year if that COVID period was part of your year? I haven't heard any flexibility coming yet, but I'm sure your industry groups will be, talking to HUD about that. Sure, Michael's got some notes, right, Michael? Yeah.
I have, there is something to remember too, that that the CARES Act also allowed for retroactive rent calculations based upon income changes. So if you were a housing authority and you're able to do a retroactive rent calculation because of a tenant's loss of income, then that may avert any kind of repayment agreement because now the rent amount would have been different anyways. So you wouldn't have to talk.
That would go to a racing repayment agreement, right? In other words, you had a repayment agreement, but now I'm giving you a rent credit going retro. So, because if I go back and give you a retro rent, yeah, I was charging you 100, but it should have been 20. Then that's in the tenant's favor, and it wouldn't increase the amount of it in a repayment agreement. If anything, it would possibly decrease it, right?
That's correct, David. We have had a problem here in Victoria where, well, at this point, RJPs are basically not hearing any evictions. It doesn't matter if it's rent related, which is covered under the state CDC order. They won't even hear evictions for other items, unauthorized occupants or criminal activity or any of that. So we had a very small, for us with processing and paperwork and whatnot, a small window of time. I mean, it seems like more, but by the time you do everything, it wasn't. To try to file some evictions in between the one that ended in July and the new one. And then if anything was still pending, of course, the JPs basically halted everything. We have, tried to reach out and sign repayment agreements and whatnot, but I have so many tenants that are delinquent that my guess is maybe in the end they'll just up and go at some point when it's more enforceable. But I've had trouble with the tenants signing a repayment agreement. We offer, but they don't want to do it. And so I have found that in my area that they're using it to their advantage, and I feel kind of stuck. I'm trying to offer, my staff is trying to offer and even doing retro certifications and whatnot and this and that. I'm still struggling with that. So I don't know if anybody else has any other ideas on how to help that.
Well, we've heard that periodically from PHAs that know that they can't get any evictions through, which really neither the CDC nor the HUD rule was intended to stop you from evicting for other reasons other than inability to pay rent. But also, I also worried that, and we're not forgiving the rent, we're just not evicting for it. And I think most people, including myself, when I pay my bills, I pay the ones that, if I can't pay all my bills, I pay the ones that I'm going to experience most pain first, right? If the cable bill, phone bill, electric bill, if those aren't paid, services are stopped. And so, or I have a big late fee. And so, I worried that by making rent, the one that you can avoid paying on the short term, I worried it would make people make poor short-term decisions on maybe the bill that's most important, because once you get that arrears of rent, it's really hard to climb out of that. So anyway, well-intentioned, but could we at some point see some large volume evictions? I guess we could. It's, I hope not, but it's possible. Oh, Megan's saying something about the Supreme Court emergency order. I couldn't see the whole thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to add for Brandy that a lot of the local JPs, at least in San Antonio, are reacting to the new orders from the Supreme Court of Texas. They set up the eviction diversion program. I think that last order was dated the 25th of September, but I swear nobody saw it until like Monday, until a couple of days ago. So I think, yeah, a lot of JP court judges are trying to be as cautious as possible to make sure that they're not violating state law. But also a lot of cities have something related to evictions going on, and counties too. So we're dealing in San Antonio with local restrictions from the city, from the county, and then all of the different, layers of judicial orders from the state.
Yeah, definitely unusual circumstances. What else?
We have to make a visualization of it because it's very confusing and conflicting. So yeah, and not necessarily designed for PHAs. So we're kind of in a unique situation.
Yeah, because really our situation is if somebody loses their income, which was the CDC order, right, really designed to protect, well, we already have that safety net, right? We can drop your rent. You can go on a hardship. We already have protections in place that don't exist in the private rental market. So, so whether it's Section 8 or public housing, we have some decent protections in place. Of course, in Section 8, if you're renting above the payment standard and you go to zero income, you still are going to owe some rent. Public housing, it's different. So, anyway.
That's true. I think we're also seeing a change in terms of additional expenses that people are facing that we wouldn't otherwise take into account for adjusting rent. So for instance, the cost of groceries has gone up like crazy recently due to COVID-19, as well as medical expenses for people who wouldn't otherwise have medical expense deductions. So it's just another factor that isn't necessarily taken into account with retroactive rent adjustments or with changes of income.
Yeah, that's a good point. Byron, Lorraine, anything you guys want to talk about? Any questions you want to throw out for thought to get people talking?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This has been delightful listening to all the questions. I just wanted to let you know that the Foster Youth to Independence notice has come out this week, and all Housing Choice Voucher Program housing authorities, I put my quotes, all are eligible to apply. So we look forward to getting a lot more housing authorities involved in the Foster Youth program. Thank you.
Can I tag on to that, Lorraine? And we are making a video that'll be going out to our housing authorities and hopefully the DFPS partners for the state of Texas too.
Other questions, discussion?
Yeah, David, this is Joe, and I just kind of wanted to acknowledge some changes, I guess, that we have going on with the HUD offices in Texas. For a large part of the last year, David Poehler has been acting in Fort Worth, and this is Joe. I've been acting in San Antonio, and so David has recently rejoined the San Antonio staff, and in Fort Worth, we now have Byron Goley, who I believe may be on the call, as the new director, and so also in a new role in Fort Worth. Eva, who you've also heard from on the call, as a division director in Fort Worth. Houston has stayed the same with Lorraine as the director, but just some changes there on the HUD side just to be aware of. David, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I know we expect to have another division director position advertised in Fort Worth sometime in the next couple of months. Things can always change, but we expect it to happen. So for housing authority staff who've always wondered if the grass is greener, there may be an opportunity if you want to keep an eye out for that advertisement. General staffing, we're not doing a lot of hiring now, but there are positions being hired here and there. So if you know folks want to work for HUD, please share that and encourage them to apply. I know our fair housing staff mentioned on the call the other day, they're going through a process of staffing up significantly. We did a call with our Fort Worth folks last week where we had somebody from Fair Housing talking about service animals and the changes that FHEO has put out, the guidance. You know, there's a notice on service animals that makes it a little bit more clear cut for housing authorities. You know, so you can confine service animals to normal household pets. The days of you having to really, you know, not be able to say, you didn't have much ability to say no, but this new FHEO guidance has tried to put some better parameters on what's okay and not okay. And I think it did a pretty good job of leading you a step-by-step, ask this, is it this? Well, then is it this? And it kind of gives you a methodology to determine your approval on service animals, so you're real consistent and you're protected by the law, where you don't find yourself facing a fair housing suit because you denied an emotional support animal or some other type of service animal.